Towns vanish from the map, replaced by hushed whispers of chanting in old barns. You have arrived at the edge of nowhere, where the farmland itself hides unspeakable devotions. Dare you witness these 3 chilling tales of rural cults, each more twisted than the last? Hollow Creek sat on a forgotten stretch of countryside, its fields dotted with crooked scarecrows and its horizon darkened by the silhouettes of looming grain silos. Outsiders rarely wandered into this place. The few who did never stayed long, citing uneasy feelings that settled into their bones like a lingering chill. Yet for the residents, life carried on in unspoken conformity. Polite greetings at the post office, subdued gossip over fences, and an ever-present sense that something older than the town itself governed their routines. Isaac Helm arrived in Hollow Creek by necessity rather than choice. He had inherited a dilapidated farmhouse from a distant relative and lacked the funds to sell it. Resigned, he moved in, intending to fix it just enough to offload the property. On his first night, he found a curious pamphlet slipped under his door. Its cover read, "The Bounty of the Reaper, a Communal Tradition." Intrigued, Isaac flipped through the pages, which extolled the virtues of an annual harvest festival. The text brimmed with references to unity and gratitude. He shrugged it off as quaint local flavor. Over the following days, he noticed how the entire town seemed to revolve around preparations for this event. Brightly painted signs displayed the date, always referred to as the Night of the Devout. Neighbors hinted that newcomers were expected to participate. Isaac, desiring acceptance, decided to volunteer for the festival. He helped string up burlap flags and weave dried corn husks into elaborate wreaths. The community welcomed him, though an undercurrent of watchfulness persisted. Conversations cut short when he asked about the festival's origins. At the local diner, he overheard rumors. Someone spoke of an ancient pact forged by Hollow Creek's founders, meant to ensure bountiful harvests, even in times of drought. Another claimed the scarecrows were no mere decorations but talismans against malevolent forces. Yet as soon as Isaac tried to pry further, the patrons fell silent, returning to their meals in tense quiet. He could not shake the sense that everyone knew more than they dared say aloud. Night of the Devout arrived, signaled by a full moon that bathed the fields in silver light. Isaac joined a procession of townsfolk along a narrow dirt path leading to the largest barn on the outskirts. No one spoke during the walk. Their footsteps on the packed earth created a dull, rhythmic thud that synced with Isaac's apprehensive heartbeat. When they reached the barn, the doors stood wide open, revealing rows of flickering lanterns arranged in a circle. At the center, bales of hay formed a makeshift altar. Isaac found himself guided to a seat near the middle. Elderly men and women, presumably the festival's leaders, huddled around the altar. One of them, a stooped figure with piercing eyes, invited Isaac to stand. He complied, feeling the weight of every gaze upon him. Without preamble, the elder spoke of long-ago famine and the founder's desperate plea to a force they referred to only as the Reaper. The elder recounted that the Reaper had agreed to bless Hollow Creek if, once each year, the town made a symbolic offering. Over time, the tradition grew into a communal rite that bound them to a power beneath the soil. The crowd fell into a solemn chant. The elder produced a small knife, its blade oddly rusted. He pressed it into Isaac's palm, instructing him to cut a single strand from a bound sheaf of wheat on the altar. Isaac hesitated, uncertain whether he was crossing a line into some ritual beyond his understanding. Yet a silent hush of anticipation prodded him on. He sliced a single stalk and placed it in a simple wooden bowl. This, he was told, symbolized his acceptance into the community. The next moment, the barn erupted in cheers. People clapped, smiling broadly, and the tension dissolved. Lanterns were raised high as a lively fiddle tune broke out from a corner of the barn. Tables laden with food appeared seemingly from nowhere. Residents danced, drank, and laughed. The abrupt shift in mood disoriented Isaac, yet he found himself swept along by the sudden joviality. He almost convinced himself that the uneasy hush he had sensed was merely local superstition. Later that night, after the revelers cleared away the remnants of the feast, the elder signaled for one final gathering. The group formed a circle around the altar again. This time, a hush fell with tangible weight. The elder, voice wavering in reverence, called out to the Reaper, thanking him for the year's abundance. He placed the bowl containing the single wheat stalk onto the hay bales. From a side door, a group of townsfolk dragged in a large canvas sack. Isaac thought he saw it move, as though something alive lurked within. Before he could speak, the sack was opened, revealing a terrified goat. The elder placed a comforting hand on the animal's head and whispered a few words. He then gestured to the knife in Isaac's hand. Confusion and horror warred in Isaac's mind. He realized the offering was not symbolic after all. The entire town stared at him, expressions expectant yet devoid of pity. The elder calmly assured Isaac that no harm would befall him if he carried through the tradition. Isaac's pulse thundered in his ears. He tried to refuse, stammering that he wanted no part in the sacrifice. But the crowd pressed closer, forming a tight ring. The goat bleated, frantic. With each second that passed, Isaac sensed the Reaper's presence invoked by the collective will. In a surge of primal terror, he raised the knife. The crowd's chant intensified, filling his head with a dizzying hum. Isaac squeezed his eyes shut, unwilling but compelled by a force he could not define. Somewhere in the confusion, the goat's bleating ceased. When Isaac opened his eyes, his hands were stained with blood, and the barn reeked of copper. The elder placed the wheat stalk in Isaac's hand, mixing it with the warm fluid. A hush followed, deeper than any silence Isaac had ever experienced. He dropped the knife, stumbling backward, bile rising in his throat. The townsfolk parted, letting him pass without interference. He fled into the moonlit fields, adrenaline and revulsion roiling in his stomach. In the days that followed, he remained in Hollow Creek, too disoriented to leave. Strangely, no one mentioned the night of the devout or the goat. They welcomed him with polite smiles, and the farmland around him thrived. Fields produced tall, healthy crops. At first, Isaac planned to run far away, but a bizarre inertia held him. He recognized the eerie comfort of belonging, even to something so dreadful. Soon, an unspoken bond tied him to the land and the Reaper's domain. He understood that his role was sealed the moment he cut that single wheat stalk. Years later, travelers passing Hollow Creek noticed a man with weary eyes overseeing the harvest. He spoke kindly, invited them to town, and offered the local produce, always fresh and bountiful. Yet in his eyes lay a vacancy, as if a part of him had been consumed by the pledge he made. Should anyone inquire about the festival, he would only smile, as though recalling a memory too sacred, or too horrifying to articulate. Hollow Creek kept growing, its lush fields reflecting the cost of its hidden sacrament, and Isaac Helms stood at its heart, an unwilling yet irrevocable disciple of the Reaper's harvest. Blackbriar was a sleepy hamlet at the junction of two winding country roads, known primarily for its sprawling wildflower fields and old wooden chapel. To a casual observer, the locals appeared pleasant enough: farmers who rose before sunrise, bakers who sold fresh bread at dawn, and children who raced each other through the meadows. Yet there was a peculiarity that few could ignore. The townspeople never ventured outdoors after the evening bells tolled. Windows were shuttered tight, and lanterns remained unlit. Strangely, a soft humming drifted over the fields at night, carried on breezes that smelled of wild honey and damp earth. Cynthia Vaughn, a traveling columnist, heard rumors of a singing field in Blackbriar, where the wind supposedly carried ghostly harmonies. Fascinated, she arrived prepared to document local legends. She found lodging at a modest inn, run by a woman named Edna Crowley. Edna was hospitable, but her kindly demeanor changed the moment Cynthia mentioned exploring the fields after sunset. Nervously, Edna insisted Cynthia keep her door locked and her lamp extinguished at night. No further explanation was offered, just a grave warning about the field's keepers. Cynthia's first days in Blackbriar were serene. She interviewed farmers who praised the land's fertility. She strolled through fields ablaze with daisies and lupines. Daylight in Blackbriar was picture perfect, and the people she met were cordial if somewhat guarded. She noticed that the local chapel, a quaint building with ivy climbing its steeple, stood as the community's social hub. Each morning, residents gathered there for a brief ceremony, though it appeared more like a communal pledge than a standard religious service. Curiosity gnawed at Cynthia. One evening, she ignored Edna's warning and ventured toward the fields after the chapel bells sounded at dusk. At first, all seemed quiet. Then beneath the rising moon, a low hum tickled her ears, a collective drone as if dozens of voices were quietly singing in unison. She followed the sound until she reached a large clearing where the wildflowers grew unnaturally tall. At the center stood a circle of carefully arranged stones etched with strange symbols. Hooded figures moved among them, each chanting a note that seamlessly wove into a haunting chord. Cynthia crouched behind a hedgerow, heart pounding. She recognized these symbols from old texts that hinted at nature-centric worship, possibly pagan in origin, but the specifics eluded her. The chanting rose and fell in hypnotic waves. Then, a figure in a tattered blue robe raised a bundle above their head. Even in the moon's dim light, Cynthia could make out a small wooden effigy shaped like a human figure, arms outstretched. The robed figure recited an incantation, and the entire circle joined in, their collective voices resonating across the field with uncanny harmony. A sudden rustling in the brush startled Cynthia. Before she could flee, two robed participants seized her arms, dragging her toward the circle. Her flashlight clattered to the ground. Panic exploded within her. She noticed their faces were oddly serene, eyes shining with something akin to devotion. The figure in the blue robe stepped forward, lowering the effigy. In a calm, measured tone, they asked for her name. Cynthia stammered, forcing out each syllable. The robed figure nodded, explaining that Blackbriar's bounty depended on this nightly offering, a song of gratitude to a presence they called the collective voice. She gleaned that they believed the land itself was alive, an ancient consciousness that required a vigilant chorus of praise lest it withhold its blessings. Although Cynthia tried to protest, the circle continued chanting, weaving her name into their melody. She felt an unsettling warmth spread through her limbs as though the sound seeped into her bones. Without warning, the figure pressed the wooden effigy into Cynthia's hands. It felt warm, pulsing faintly, as if it were alive. An overwhelming dizziness gripped her. The chanting became all-encompassing, enveloping her thoughts. For a moment, she thought she could discern words in the droning hum, whispers that urged her to join, to let go of her fears and become one with the collective voice. She recognized an echo of comfort, something that promised belonging. With a surge of will, she pushed back against the spell, her mind grappling for clarity. Sensing her resistance, the robed participants tightened their circle around her. A wave of agitation rippled through them. The figure in blue insisted that she continue to hold the effigy until her body and voice harmonized with the congregation. Cynthia resisted, hurling the object aside. At that moment, a fierce gust swept through the field, flattening the wildflowers and snuffing out several lanterns. The circle's chant faltered, a trembling hush fell as though the land itself took offense at Cynthia's defiance. She took advantage of the sudden chaos, dashing through the parted stones toward the inn. The circle did not chase her, but she felt their accusatory stares. Once inside her room, she barricaded the door, her breath ragged. She heard no pursuing footsteps, yet the memory of the chanting lingered, a faint echo in her mind. Sleep offered no relief. She dreamt of wandering the field under a heavy moon, her voice added to the collective drone. At dawn, she found Edna waiting by her door, eyes brimming with worry. Edna explained that the nightly ritual began decades ago when a terrible blight threatened Blackbriar's crops. A traveling preacher convinced the village elders to honor a nebulous presence in the land, forging a covenant of song. The harvests improved, and the practice became ingrained in daily life. Now, any disruption risked angering the entity. If the chanting ceased, Edna believed the land would wither. More chillingly, she implied that new voices were sometimes recruited by force. Determined to leave, Cynthia packed her belongings. She hurried to her car, only to discover the engine refused to start. With growing panic, she realized the entire town might be united in preserving their hold on her. From the chapel's direction, a distant hum floated across the morning air. Desperate, she commandeered a bicycle left unchained near the bakery and pedaled furiously down the main road. The chanting grew faint behind her. Eventually, she reached a highway gas station, breathless and shaken. Once safe in a nearby city, Cynthia reported her ordeal, but authorities found no evidence of wrongdoing. Blackbriar's residents maintained that the nightly singing was merely a harmless tradition. In the absence of tangible proof, her claims went unheeded. Nevertheless, she published a short piece on an obscure blog, warning travelers about Blackbriar's hidden custom. The post garnered little attention, but on sleepless nights, she still heard echoes of that uncanny melody, a reminder that somewhere under moonlit fields, a chorus sang not just for harvests, but to keep a deeper power content. Rosewood Valley lay tucked between rolling hills, its farmland sprawling across gentle slopes. An air of pastoral calm reigned by day, with tidy rows of vegetables and orchards bursting with fruit. By night, however, a brooding stillness settled in, and locals locked their doors firmly. The reason for this had less to do with wild animals and more to do with a secret covenant rumored to date back generations. Samuel Wright, an amateur historian, arrived to collect family records rumored to be archived in the old Rosewood Library. He found lodging in a small guest house perched atop a hill, offering a panoramic view of the valley. Each evening, after the sun dipped below the horizon, he noticed a single lantern glow in the far distance near the orchard edges. The light never wavered, as though someone stood vigil in the darkness. Curiosity led Samuel to ask around. Most townspeople claimed ignorance about the lantern or brushed off his queries with polite deflection. An elderly librarian, Miss Porter, hinted at a vow made by Rosewood's early settlers. They pledged fealty to the land, she said cryptically, so the land would protect them in turn. Sensing more beneath her words, Samuel pressed for details, but she merely shook her head, directing him to the library's dimly lit local history section. Late one afternoon, Samuel pored over brittle ledgers and diaries. One battered journal, penned by a settler named Enoch Gale, revealed disturbing clues. It spoke of a dusk-bound oath, sealed under the shadow of a towering oak tree. In exchange for safe passage and fertile soil, the settlers vowed to keep nightly watch at the orchard's edge. The text implied that failure to maintain this watch would break the pact and invite a great misfortune. Samuel's hands trembled as he read. References to missing children, livestock found drained of blood, and a spectral figure glimpsed between the orchard rows. Determined to see if the legend held merit, Samuel set out that very evening. Armed with a flashlight, he crossed the farmland, following the gentle slope until he reached the orchard boundary. Darkness had fallen, and the single lantern he'd spotted from the guest house glowed about 50 yards ahead. He approached cautiously, soon realizing it hung from a low branch of a venerable oak. Beneath it stood a figure cloaked in a long coat, eyes reflecting the lantern light. The figure made no move to greet Samuel, remaining as still as a statue. Summoning courage, Samuel introduced himself. The figure, a stoic man named Harold Finch, offered a curt nod. He explained that each night, a different villager assumed the role of watchman, standing guard until dawn. No one spoke openly of it, but everyone understood their turn would come. If asked for more details, Harold would only say, "We pay our due to keep the valley safe." As the night deepened, an uneasy hush fell over the orchard. The air felt thick, charged with latent energy. Harold never left his post, never sat down, and never extinguished the lantern. Something about his rigid stance reminded Samuel of an ancient sentinel. The minutes stretched into hours. At intervals, a faint rustling moved through the trees. Though no breeze blew, leaves quivered as if brushed by invisible hands. Close to midnight, Harold tensed. He raised a hand for silence. Samuel followed his gaze, straining to see through the rows of fruit-bearing trees. An icy sensation prickled across his neck. He heard a soft whisper, indistinct yet undeniably human, drifting between the trunks. Harold's expression hardened. He lifted a small horn from his coat pocket and blew into it, producing a low, melancholic note. The orchard fell silent. From the gloom beyond the lantern's glow, a shape glided into view. Its outline suggested a human form, but something about its movement defied natural laws. It seemed to hover rather than walk, and its limbs appeared elongated. Samuel stared, feeling both terror and an odd fascination. The figure paused at the edge of the light, head cocked as though observing them. Harold stood firm, gripping the horn. No words were exchanged, yet the tension in the air crackled like static before a storm. The figure receded into the darkness, leaving only the faint rustle of disturbed leaves. Harold exhaled, lowering the horn. He explained that this was the presence the orchard watch was meant to keep at bay. Local legend named it a spirit, A guardian or an avenging wraith, no one was certain. All that mattered was upholding the nightly watch so it never fully entered the valley. Should the lantern go out or the watchman abandon his post, the entity would roam free, exacting a toll on the unprotected. Shaken, Samuel assisted Harold until dawn, though he felt more like an onlooker than a partner. By first light, the orchard looked ordinary again. Dew glistening on the grass, the trees swaying gently in a morning breeze. Harold extinguished the lantern and left without further ceremony. Samuel returned to the guest house, thoughts whirling. He could not decide if he had just witnessed a bizarre community custom or something genuinely supernatural. Over the following days, Samuel interviewed various townsfolk. Most pretended ignorance, but he sensed their underlying fear. A few warned him not to meddle with the orchard's business. If the watch were disrupted by an outsider's interference, the entire valley might suffer the consequences. Deeply conflicted, Samuel realized his best option was to leave. Yet a nagging sense of responsibility weighed on him. If the orchard's nightly vigil was all that stood between peace and devastation, how could such a fragile pact endure indefinitely? On his last night in Rosewood, he decided to keep the watch himself, hoping to glean final answers. Under the familiar oak, he lit the lantern. As darkness settled, the orchard grew eerily still. Hours slipped by in silent anticipation. Eventually, the spectral figure appeared once more, drifting at the boundary of light. Samuel attempted to speak, but the words died in his throat. A moment passed in which he sensed immeasurable distance between them, as if the entity inhabited a realm adjacent to his own. Then it vanished, leaving the lantern's flame dancing in the silent orchard. By dawn, the horizon glowed with soft orange. Samuel carefully closed the lantern's shutter and turned to depart, only to find Harold Finch watching from afar. Harold gave a single nod, acknowledging Samuel's unexpected guardianship. Without a word, they parted. Samuel packed his belongings that morning, departing Rosewood Valley in a haze of conflicting emotions: fear, amazement, and lingering confusion. He told no one of what transpired. Who would believe that an entire valley's peace hung on a nightly lantern vigil, warding away a half-seen specter? In the ensuing weeks, he documented his experience in a private notebook, aware that any public account would be met with skepticism. The orchard lingered in his dreams, a place where the line between mortal commitment and supernatural forces blurred beyond comprehension. Perhaps he sensed that Rosewood's oath would endure only as long as its inhabitants maintained their unwavering watch, each dawn a reprieve from the darkness that lurked on the periphery of civilization. You have stepped into a realm where lonely roads lead to haunting secrets. In these tales of rural cults, we glimpse the thin line between fertile earth and the dark pacts that sustain it. Thank you for joining us. May your own small towns sleep a little safer tonight.